Hello and welcome to this video, and I have with me, and I'm sure you know who it is Mr. Martin Popoff. How are you, Martin?
Doing okay, Andy. Very cool being on the show with you, man. I'm a little nervous, but we'll see what happens.
Oh, I'm nervous to have you on. I've been watching you and on various YouTube videos for many years, reading your books, and I really wanted you on because I keep coming back to this idea of the new wave of British heavy metal. In 1980 in the
Yeah.
UK, I was 12 years old and it sort of scooped me up. And my journey into all the music I like actually started there. And it started with this idea that I wasn't aware of until you voiced it consciously, which is as kids, we were looking for heaviness. We were
Yeah.
searching it out like sort of, I don't know, hunter-gatherers out in the fields of rock, trying to find those morsels of juicy heaviness, which was a very esoteric thing. Really, it could be anywhere, and you often would find it in different places. TV soundtracks sometimes, and you go, oh, that. And it wasn't just about the electric guitar; it was a whole host of things. So, how would you describe that from your angle? I mean, how did you get into music, and how did you discover heaviness?
It's exactly the same thing. I mean, I remember. So my first memories are Puff the Magic Dragon, and then Columbia Music House thing where it was like Three Dog Night and Creedence Clearwater and Steppenwolf. But even just randomly finding these things, it's like, okay, I'm looking at Three Dog Night, and it's a bunch of long haired guys with handlebar mustaches. They look badass, right? Like these guys are heavy looking. The music wasn't heavy, but even Steppenwolf, it's like now you're noticing an extreme vocal, like a heaviness of vocal happening, even though the music's not heavy. But then you hear Born to Be Wild, right? Or you hear the opening of Magic Carpet Ride, right? Creedence Clearwater Revival, I think back even these days, thinking that was an extreme vocal on top of that, Civil War era music, kind of thing, right? Like this old timey kind of music that they were doing. But yes, so when I in '72, when I was 9, and basically discovered that I was a crazy music fan, right? And was going to be an uncommonly crazy music fan. Yeah, you were hit with things like uh Led Zeppelin rock and roll, Black Dog, then it was Nazareth, Deep Purple. And yeah, exactly like you say, me and my buddies had an actual mathematical rating system looking for heaviness on albums. And it was, there were lousies, there were so-sos, and there were goods. And goods could have lousy good, average good, or really good. And on any given album, and I can remember dozens and dozens and dozens of the ratings. That's a 7 out of 9. That's a 6 out of 8. That's a 5 out of 7, even though there's 11 songs on it, because a so-so, cancels out, right? And we would literally, one of us would get an album, we'd get on the phone and say it's 7 out of 9 with 4 really goods, right? And things like that, right? And essentially anything with instruments that were not guitar, bass, and drums was very likely to be in the lousy category. But that's just your quiet music, right? And
Yeah.
also with records, you would go into the used record store and you would take the used record out of the sleeve, and you would just look and see what how much darkness is there in the grooves versus lightness, right? Because the lighter it was, the noisier it was, right? And so you knew immediately how many ballads were on it that way, right? Or you'd check the instruments on the back, or you check the song titles. Are there enough violent sounding song titles? Are there too many of them with 7 words and one of them is love in it, and all that sort of stuff, right? So yeah, we did that all that whole time, and I just remember I remember having like a one-track mind, at least until about 1977, 78, where all this stuff, this cool way you talk about the cultural and lyrical versus the prog, but at that time, me being a drummer at that time as well, I had both that started to come along in, say, grade 11, grade 12. And so there was a lot of we loved, I was all over everything to do with punk. But then I was also all over a lot to do with post punk. And then at the same time, all prog was on the table as well. So at that point, at that nexus point of 79, it's almost like unconsciously, it was getting to the point where you've discovered all the heaviness that there was out there. and then maybe that pushed you into punk and post-punk and prog. But then all of a sudden, the new wave of British heavy metal comes along, and all your lawn mowing money and paper route money. And I used to even how heavy metal is this? I used to even water and mow the cemetery. Um, so all that money, all that work money, and also, I mean, starting at about 15 years old, I started working in a stereo store and running record departments in our little town, right? So I was a nut, right? A complete music nut, right? But yeah, all of a sudden, there was this whole pile of records that would come out, and what was advertised on the tin was what was going to be inside, because we've got the advent of heavy metal illustration. We've got the live shots on the back. There's not going to be any ballads. If it is, it's going to be a doomy dirge like a Black Sabbath ballad or something to do with prog, right? But it's not going to be a love song sort of thing. So the point is that even though all that other stuff was happening at the same time, this was the very first time that there was almost like too much heavy metal to buy for your teenage dollars, kind of thing. And that truly was not the point. Up until that point, I've written a lot about the year 1979 and how there seems to be heavy metal's going out of vogue. All the American bands, well, first off, all the British bands went kaput. There's no more Deep Purple. Black Sabbath's on the descent. They technically even break up a little bit. Uriah Heep's not doing anything good. And the American bands at that point that sort of took over are starting to falter. You've got a faltering career with Aerosmith and Ted Nugent and Kiss, certainly, and Blue Oyster Cult and all those bands. So it really did feel like that was the first time that it felt like heavy metal was not in vogue, but it was very temporary. You had a connective tissue of Van Halen, I suppose, but it was very temporary. And then this great thing that we all love, the new wave of British heavy metal, comes in.
Yes, it's so interesting from your side of the pond to hear virtually an identical story as well. It's very interesting. There's so much there that I want to explore. If I One of the things that was interesting to me looking back at that time was that, for example, my dad was he liked Latin American music. So he'd got into Santana, and he had two albums by Santana, Amigos and Abraxas. And on Abraxas, there's a track called I Hope You're Feeling Better. Now, that is an example of, it's not a heavy metal band, it's not even a heavy rock band, but that was just a little bit heavier. So when my dad would put the album on, that would be a little bit Dory. Now, I love Santana now because I like everything and it doesn't matter. But every now and then, Santana would get a little bit heavier. Probably the apex would be when they did The Dealer off that album. And so I was grading a lot of all sorts of different music as being heavy. And I think what's interesting is I think maybe the original rockers like the Sabbaths and the Zeppelins and the Deep Purples, they're exploring a sort of 1960s hippie blues bass sort of psychedelic thing, and they're exploring these areas. Hendrix has been really important, I think, for all of those bands. But I don't know whether they were exploring heaviness in the same way as us being like a second generation. We're actually looking for it, and I felt the new wave of British heavy metal was almost like second generation trying to go, right, this is what makes something heavy. We love the sort of leather and studs of Judas Priest. We love all the Satan stuff of Black Sabbath. We like the fact when Van Halen go really fast, they got that double bass drum. And there's actually all these different bits, and especially guitarists like Uli John Roth and Schenker that were just going a little bit further than Jimmy Page. Richie Blackmore was my guy, in terms of that. There was also things like these very majestic tracks like Freebird and Stairway to Heaven, which seemed to be, really artistic pieces, and they built to something that had a lot of guitars and was quite heavy. So I felt that the new wave of British heavy metal was almost like created by heavy metal fans, and it was a bringing together all these bits we liked that didn't quite come together. Yeah. And they were very close to the fans. You felt that they were fans making the music, and that they were pulling all the bits that we'd liked in their individual things Does that make sense? You know?
Absolutely. I love that idea. That's a great idea. That's a super cool insight. It's the first heavy metal made by heavy metal fans,
Yeah.
right? And because, and I think we have a little bit of a disagreement. I look at a lot of your old videos, and to me, one of the big points about the invention of heavy metal is the ruthless leaching out and excising of the blues from it, right? So to me, Led Zeppelin is still hung up with the British folk boom and the British blues boom, and this is why heavy metal doesn't get invented in America for a long time, because Mountain and Cactus are hung up in that as well. But Black Sabbath and Deep Purple and Uriah Heep have this large, classical element, also Diablos in Musica, the tritone, the Devil's Note, all that stuff. But and I have this argument with people all the time that I hear no blues in Black Sabbath whatsoever, except a little bit on the first album, and then they actually make a boogie rock song later on in Rock and Roll Doctor, right? But other than that, and then we can get into the more abstract esoterics of, is Tony doing a bluesy solo, right? But when it comes to the songs, I don't hear any blues whatsoever, and to me, this is why Black Sabbath, it's not a remarkable idea, but I mean, Black Sabbath is the first proper heavy metal album. Anything before that is proto. But it's also why Black Sabbath deserves credit for being so much being so much more imaginative and moving the dial forward over someone like a Led Zeppelin. Granted, Led Zeppelin had 2 albums in 1969, and Black Sabbath is arriving February 13th, 1970. But still, I love that idea of essentially soon as anything to do with the blues is dropped from it, that's when heavy metal is invented.
I agree.
I got to ask you something, Andy.
I agree 100% with that. And I actually think that when the punk bands come in, they actually drag even more of the blues out of it again. They retain a certain aspect of heaviness, but it I would say it's almost like they drag the soul out of it as well, because there's a lot of soul in there. But the way I'd counter this is knowing those guys that were around in the 60s and talking to them. There's the blues as in the rock pentatonic and bending and all that 12-bar stuff, but there's also the blues of Howlin' Wolf singing Evil or Smokestack Lightning. There's another aesthetic that I think they're drawing on, the idea of selling your soul to the devil. There's a darkness in there that they're going towards, and I think what Sabbath do is they replace the darkness in the blues with this British hammer horror. It's a very gothic English thing that especially if you know the people in Birmingham and their sort of way of approaching music. I know these guys. And it's see the guys in Sabbath are very similar to the guys in Slade, and both of those Slade have got no blues in them as well, and can be very heavy at times. It's the Englishness. I think it's the Englishness coming in.
Well, I got to tell you, a funny definition of heavy metal. I remember Tim Henderson from Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles and me sitting. This was one of our finest hours, but we got to interview all of the reunited Black Sabbath in 2 pairs in their hotel rooms, right? And I remember sitting there with Geezer and Tony, and I don't remember what my question was. How did you guys invent heavy metal or something? And Tony goes, well, Martin, instead of going from here to here, and I'll go over here. Instead of going from here to here, I went from here to here. That was it. That's the invention of heavy metal right there, right? And I guess what he's getting at is the tritone, right? The Diablos in Musica idea, right?
Yeah. Well, the thing is that starts with Purple Haze.
Well, okay.
When Hendrix starts off on Purple Haze, his second single, way before anybody else, and he goes gang, 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 and he does that flat 5. Yeah. That's heavy metal.
Yeah.
It's all there. And Hendrix is totally the blues. And I would love to give you an intelligent explanation as to why Hendrix did that at that point in time. I'd love to know where it comes from.
Yeah.
But for me, that's it.
So here's the deal. So I wrote this book called Who Invented Heavy Metal. It's 120,000 words that ends in 1971. So all of that history is in here, right? Now all of those little bits and pieces are in here. And what I arrive at, Hendrix is a huge deal. We're doing a Contrarians series based on these albums, right? But 2 points. So all of those little bits and pieces are throughout this book. Like I said, this ends in 1971, right? But the one I arrive at is the Johnny Burnett trio, Train Kept a Rollin' from 1956. And as I sort of explain in the book, I don't particularly hear the blues anymore in this. It's up tempo. It's got a slightly extreme vocal. It's got some slight hair on the guitar. And it's got a little bit of a manic solo. And that's all these little pieces are coming along, just like your excellent treatise that arrived at I think it was the Howlin' Wolf, right? You were big on that as an entry point. But yeah, all of those blues things along the way, all the like first uses of feedback and distortion, and whether it was distortion from apocryphal amps falling off of trucks or being slashed with it's always got to be a switchblade knife, right? Yep. Or a proper pedal or satisfaction, and that causing the growth in sales of distortion pedals and all that. So that's one point. But the other point that I always like to make is the intentionality of a full album of this stuff, right? So this is why I don't feel Blue Cheer is particularly intentional. MC5 much more. I mean, I think Kick Out the Jams is if you had to pick one pre-Black Sabbath album, I would go with Kick Out the Jams, but it cheats because it's live, right? It's easy to be heavy live, right? So all of that. And then the second Blue Cheer is also pretty important. People usually lean on the first one. One other definition of heavy metal that I always kind of make is this idea of literally use of distortion pedal. That's one definition. Another one is slightly more complicated than that, but the idea of it's a cold day and a bunch of guys are standing in an alley, standing around an oil drum with a fire, and they're warming their hands. Well, what they're warming their hands off of in a heavy metal song is that guitar riff. So everybody is paying attention to the riff. The riff is central. Possibly, people have said this before, but possibly the bass guitarist is playing the same riff as the rhythm guitarist.
Yeah, I think
right?
that's and that is Black Sabbath pretty much because of I think Geezer Butler being a guitarist and not a bass player. So Cream were doing that, yes, but Jack Bruce would also have the virtuosity to sort of jump off that. I mean, Sunshine of Your Love does this, but I think I'm listening to what you're saying. I think what you've got is rock and roll embodies youthful rebellion, and there's a whole bunch of things that are in that. And when you start to add all those up and you actually tease those out so you get the raw juice of rebellion, that's what heavy metal is. And I've always thought, when I was a kid, what did I like about heavy metal? And there was an aggression and a sort of male, like I'm a man and I'm going to go out and fight. There was a something that was exciting, and it was I think when Jack Black says in School of Rock, you're standing up against the man. That is basically what the riff is: the distorted guitar riff with the heavy drums. Now, of course, that static riff is also coming out of soul and funk. There's a whole James Brown, Cold Sweat, the vocal. When you listen to him screaming in Cold Sweat, that is heavy metal. So there's a lot of elements that come from a lot of different.
Another thing, Andy, though, something that you speak so eloquently on all the time. I know you, and you deliberately in that last video about self-loathing mentioned this, how you deliberately want to focus on music that is. I'll use these words because I think this is important. Music that is objectively good. Let's just call it prog and jazz and fusion at this point.
Where's the music you're listening to, not the cultural impact.
Yeah, cultural, lyrical, right? So the interesting thing here is that another magical thing about heavy metal is it is that as well. Now, I'm not saying it's as progressive as prog or jazz and fusion, but what I'm saying is when you listen to it, you're sort of you can be impressed with the power and the majesty of it, where objectively your brain is telling you that this is clearly the best kind of music to make. It's very exciting. It's like at the front edge of the best music. Now, I'm not saying it's the best for chops, but when I say that, I also have this rant that I talk about is like, I swear that Heart gets more excited about playing Barracuda than anything in their catalog, right? The fans have voted Barracuda probably the top Heart song of all time. I'm sure Mark Knopfler gets a kick out of playing that opening riff to Money for Nothing, right?
Which is a
And
heavy
it's
metal
like
riff.
I always
That's
have this.
that's an example. Dire Straits are so not a heavy metal band, but Money
Exactly.
for Nothing, when it opens up, is heavy metal.
Exactly. So my point is that even these non-metal people, something must go off in their head, not to name drop. And I'm nobody. I've not met too many heavy, important people or whatever, right? But I did have an interview with Paul McCartney once, and he said, and he articulated this, and it's not that I was even pushing him about this, but we were talking about Helter Skelter, right? And he said, oh yeah, Mon, there's something absolutely amazing about just turning up and rocking and playing loud and stuff. And it literally is that idea that I keep rattling on all the time. It's like people love heavy metal, they just don't know it, right? I mean, I'm always fascinated how Metallica can be such a huge band, right? And to me, it's a little, or why AC/DC Back in Black was such a big deal, right? That is an extreme vocalist on top of that music, right?
The best way it was summed up was when I went to see Chris Cornell live, and he said he was doing his acoustic thing, and he said at this point in the set I wanted to do a song that everybody knows, a real middle of the road song. He says something that almost for the whole family. So he thought, what shall I do? I'll do a U2 song. So he decides to do One by U2, very touchy feely song. So he Googles it, and that's not the song that comes up. He says One by Metallica comes up, and then he suddenly felt proud that what Metallica could trump U2 in this thing, because, and he said, you think what this song's about, you think what the lyrical matter's about, and you think about what's going on, and the fact it's like a prog epic, and it's got all this, and yet that is trumping U2. And what you've said about heavy metal, I think the thing I loved about heavy metal when I was a kid, that it was brilliant musically, and I could appreciate it. And it would, Iron Maiden would sing about, having trips to the North Pole in a balloon, and then they'd sing about like the Vikings invading the all really interesting stuff that I was interested in, but it wasn't intellectual. I didn't quite understand it at the time. I was almost annoyed at the critics and the music press. They were like looking down on it, which meant they were looking down on me, like I was a fool in other words, for liking this stuff, that I should have been like my friends, all listening to Jesus and the Mary Chain or whatever it is that they liked, Cabaret Voltaire. And when those bands were good, it was because they got heavy. All those indie bands, I was like thinking, well, you're listening to The Cure. The best song by The Cure was Screw off Head on the Door with that big distorted riff. I like that one. And so this is the thing that you made me actually, when I've listened to you talk, I thought this is really interesting, that this is a thing. And part of it is the anti-intellectualness. And I think all these great bands, they've won the test of time. Nobody will now say that Black Sabbath is terrible. The coolest person will have to say Black Sabbath was terrible. But I remember when it wasn't the case, that Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin in the 1980s, Led Zeppelin was seen as a joke band almost.
Well, the funny thing, Andy, so here's the way I sometimes look at Rush when I like defend Rush, because a lot of me goes to that. Like, I would love to talk to you for 2 hours about this Clash and Ramones idea, right? Because here, let's go there for just a second. Briefly.
Yeah, go there.
Okay, so one thing I've noticed over the years is I've actually my respect for the lyrical mien of heavy metal has gone down when I watch retrospectives on all this stuff about Jesus and Mary Chain or Clash or Cure or Joy Division, or, you know, to pick some of your real bugbears,
Yeah, all
Bruce
the stuff that
Springsteen
well, I'm only
or Lou
picking
Reed
on
and all
them.
that, right?
I am only picking on them because the critics like them. It's
Okay,
just,
okay.
and the
But let
critics
me
no
say this.
longer
So,
they just to
mhm,
set it out. The
yeah.
critics, they don't do this anymore because
Mhm,
this is the history. But what's happened is it's created a narrative to the whole rock thing,
yeah.
which is now dying. And if nobody talks about it, everybody will think that the Velvet Underground were the most important band in 1967,
Yeah. Yeah.
67, and
True.
they
Yeah.
weren't.
Yep.
They
Yeah.
weren't.
But
It's Black
so
Sabbath.
yeah, my point is like you can compare this to realist art, you know, the multi-million dollar Van Goghs, or you could compare it to Robert Bateman painting a wolf. You know, those things you could argue are objectively good, like Prague is objectively good. But then, you know, what are some of the biggest artists of all time? It's the modern art movement from New York, the abstract art movement from the 50s to the 70s. Those guys are, you know, that's where I've listened to so many sort of documentaries on this, where you know, and I'm comparing the metal guys and going, the Jam or Ecstasy or the Buzzcocks, these people were creating an aesthetic, and in a sense they were playing 3D chess, where I'm starting to realize my metal heroes were not playing 3D chess. They were just like, let's open the book and copy Kubla Khan or whatever, right? Or let's talk about a war movie that we saw, right? Whereas I almost feel like there is this wisdom level to this other stuff, and now we can get into also the Platonic ideal of great songwriting, like Billy Joel, Tom Petty, Fleetwood Mac, and the biggest of all, the Beatles, right? But that's a whole different thing. But so my point is that the Clash and the Ramones and all these things, and Lou Reed, right, are abstract artists, and prog and metal are realist artists. They're just trying to paint a photograph, right?
Well, the way I see it is that in the 1960s, as rock and roll emerged, and I think when Bob Dylan did, you know, the times they are a changing, blowing in the wind, and all that sort of stuff, there was this idea that there was a wisdom and worth in this sort of cheesy, visceral rock and roll. You know, that there was actually a great, you know, when you listen to Johnny B. Good or you listen to Tutti Frutti, there was something in there that was great art. It wasn't just entertainment, novelty music. It was great. And I think that idea spurs the whole rock and roll movement to move towards rock. And what happens at a certain point is that normal working class people, like the guys in Black Sabbath, are able to make very sophisticated music, and they start to explore all the stuff they're interested in, and that goes on and on and on. And then I think when the Ramones come out, then they go back to singing songs about sniffing glue and stuff like that, which is great. And I've got to be honest, I criticised the Ramones, and I'm not a massive punk fan. The only reason I got about the Sex Pistols because I saw them reform in 2008, and seeing them live, they blew me away. I'm sure if I saw the Ramones live, they would blow me away. It wasn't punk, it was just heavy rock. That's what the Sex Pistols were when I saw them live, and they were brilliant. And I think that turn to visceral rock and roll is great, but I think the critics at that time couldn't stand from their sort of with their sort of English degrees and their literate intellectual point where they're at, of snotty brummies like Black Sabbath doing what they were doing, or middle class English people like, you know, I don't know, Pink Floyd doing what they were doing. I think there was by the 70s there's a different dynamic in rock and roll, because as we said, it's now stabilized, and now you've got rock and roll critics and you've got bands, and I just felt like I was being patronized by a certain intellectual type by going, you see this song where they're talking about sniffing glue, this is much better than Rush, you know, integrating the legend of Kubla Khan into a sort of heavy rock prog context. And in the end, I could step back and go, no, they're both really good. That what Rush should do is really interesting. You know, it's
Mm-hmm.
really interesting that they're exploring that. It's almost like the critics, I felt, were like going, you rockers are getting above your station. We need something that'll make us look good, the critics.
Mm-hmm.
Because I can't see lyrically where the Clash are any greater than any rock band.
Well, okay, so yeah, I mean, I can see that now. Actually, going back, I mean, lyrics is when you think of Bob Dylan and when you think of rap, you think I may as well just have a book of this stuff, right? Because
Yeah,
the music behind it. I mean, rap you can appreciate also if you're a studio engineer, right? There's just so
yeah,
much amazing stuff going on. But Bob Dylan, you can't really appreciate beyond the lyrics unless you're like a folk scholar or
yeah,
something,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
There's just not much going on. But the thing with number one, I think people love those bands like the Ramones and stuff because they knew them and they were in the same town as them and they were hanging out with these bands, right? And they became friends. And when you become friends, you build more narrative into what's going on too. But I think what happens is like I say, it's abstract art in that it's not the lyrics to Carbona Not Glue or whatever. It's the entire package of all the lyrics, the look, the album cover, what they do live, the audacity to play these short songs. You know, the reinventing heavy metal into something completely different that we hadn't heard before. So the idea of breaking records is a big deal, right?
Mm.
Because this gets into this whole thing about who's the best drummer, right? It's you're just like in sports, you're the best drummer from 73 to 75. And then someone breaks the record, and then you're the best drummer from 78 to 81, right?
Yeah.
And then someone breaks that record and does something entirely new, and then you're the best drummer from this period. And it's exactly like sports. But so I think what I've come to appreciate more so over the years is that there's an I did one of my podcast episodes on snow globe bands, right? A little snow globe where you shake it and the snow is going, right? So bands that have created like a hermetically sealed little world that has various bizarre rules that don't exist for anybody else. I think the Who's a little bit like that. The Stranglers certainly are like that.
The
Typo
Residents would be the
Negative.
ultimate snow globe.
Who's that?
The Residents.
The Residents, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. But you think of a Typo Negative, right?
yeah.
Just like who else has this life philosophy, and with the neon green and with Pete Steele and with the weird kind of strange music they make. But the Ramones are a perfect snow globe band, right? Nobody else ever did anything like the Ramones. Nobody looked like them, sounded like them, put this all day. Nobody had a name like the Ramones, right? So I think they get a lot of credit for that stuff. Now I just wanted to mention one other sort of definition of heavy metal, which kind of gets at the same point, right? Or it gets at the slightly different point. Like put the Ramones and Clash over here, but now let's go over here to Billy Joel, Fleetwood Mac, Eagles, Beatles. Okay, the Platonic ideal of songwriting, right? Perfect songs that touch millions of people. They're really simple. They're even lyrically simple, right? So another way I like looking at heavy metal, and I like bringing this up when we talk about heavy metal getting more extreme and more extreme into thrash, into death, into black, into what we have now, which is very progressive, complicated, mathematical, completely extreme metal. And it's actually kind of mainstream, right? Which is bizarre. It's like, how are kids' heads wired, right? So another definition I like about heavy metal, and it gets a little bit to what I said about Heart Barracuda as well, is I said the oil drum and we're warming our hands over the riff. Well, heavy metal is also a bunch of guys crowding around the hood of a car, a hot car, with the engine all tricked out and cleaned, and all the wires are changed to the color wires, and there's a guy sitting in the driver's seat revving that engine, right? And they're all standing around looking at this engine wobble back and forth in there, right? To me, that's a definition of heavy metal as well, and one of the reasons I like that definition as heavy metal progresses is that car is impractical for use, right? If you speed, you will get a ticket. If you speed, you might die. If you speed, you might get your license taken away, right? That car cannot actually be used anywhere unless you have an arrangement and you go to a racetrack and you use it, or you street race illegally or something with it, right? It
Well, what
literally
you're describing there is totally embodied by Hot for Teacher by Van Halen. Which
right.
even starts off with the car, and the thing about that song that upset me when I heard it, I was like, "This should be the greatest song ever, except it's
Yeah.
not a song. It's not
Exactly. Not a
functioning
song.
like a
Yes.
song.
Yes. And black metal is not a song,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Black metal is also a form of abstract art, right? And but today's super incredibly progressive heavy metal is also slightly unpractical, but
yeah,
it's a beautiful piece of technology. And that's kind of what prog is in a way. So when those critics would put down prog, they would be saying this is a beautiful piece objectively of technology, but it doesn't have any practical use in the world, right? The Eagles or Fleet. I'm blanking on song titles, but even Elton John, Crocodile Rock, right,
yeah.
has a practical use in the world, whereas Gates of Delirium doesn't, according to these critics, right? So one is not illegal, the other one is illegal, and it can't be used, right? Because you'll lose your job if you stay in the morning drinking your coffee listening to Gates Delirium, because you'll show up late, right, for work. So that's
Well,
kind of an interesting thing too.
this reminds me of something that Robert Plant once said to me down the pub once, where we were chatting about Queen, and he said, he goes, we were nothing like Queen. He said, because Queen songs you can sing down the pub. Everyone can sing "We Are the Champions." He said you cannot sing a Led Zeppelin song because it's just basically him going push, push, and all that bit. And Robert
Yeah.
knew that, and he knew that that was what they were doing. And then as time has gone on, once he got to his solo career, he started to explore songwriting a lot more, and that actually emerges with Led Zeppelin as they develop. It's actually there on the first album because they've still got that 1960s "Your Time Is Gonna Come." That's a pop song, and then at the end you've got "All of My Love," which is a song. It's a really interesting distinction that you make, is the idea of the utility of it for normal people. It's the normal people. So you have heavy metal's a style of music that's not for the normal people. That's why I liked it. It was representing a whole bunch of people that we weren't cool. We weren't part of the mainstream. We didn't think, it was a mixture of rebellious and nerdy at the same time. All these things were in it. And I can remember when I got older and I was old enough to then go to heavy metal clubs. We'd go up to Birmingham there was a place called Edwards number 8, and you go into there. And as soon as you got in there, you knew you were safe because even though they looked all terrifying, it was the nicest bunch of people that didn't judge anybody whatsoever. And so this is all the stuff that I feel was contained within this, and it was the same thing with the Gates of Delirium and all the prog lot. There was something down to earth about it, which I think the intelligentsia didn't like, and I think punk is very interesting because I think punk had that as well. That was the statements that it made. The critics jumped on it, but I think if you say, well, what happened to punk? What happened to punk is it turns into new wave of British heavy metal, turns into heavy metal, basically. There's nowhere else it goes. Where else does it go? You can't look at sort of the new wave bands or the sort of new romantic bands, any of those. They're so opulent. It's like they've returned back to prog. It's
Yeah.
in bands like Motorhead. It's in bands like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. And I think here in the UK, the new wave of British heavy metal actually emerged out of a club scene that had emerged in the UK punk. So you got bands like
Yeah.
Dumpy's, Rusty Nuts. You'd got all the neo
Yeah.
proggers like Marillion and IQ. All those bands were in these small clubs, and it was a collection of people going, "We're just going to do whatever we want," and that's what births what most people would call proper heavy metal. Which,
Yeah. Before we finish, I want to make sure that I show you my props. So we've got the Motorhead plastic relief here of
oh wow,
Overkill sent to me by Doug Smith, their manager,
yeah.
right? So I took that out because you mentioned Motorhead, and
Well, they are the
I,
band for me. That they embody the whole lot.
yes, but I also want to push back a little bit and say that I agree with because we know there was a divide between the punks and the metalheads. What punk provided, I think, and you stumble upon this with your idea of the fans, right? The fans creating metal. I think punk reminded fans of what they loved about heaviness, number one, and also with punk you got the infrastructure of people putting out singles on their own and small labels, because previous to that everything essentially came out on a large label. I wanted to bring this out as well. Um, this is the copy of Sounds magazine with Ted Nugent on the cover, right? Where you get the very first mention of the new wave of British heavy metal, and it's in this article when Jeff Barton is sent over to the sound house to check out these bands, right? And so the article is by Jeff Barton, but you might not, I get complaints being very directional, but Alan Lewis wrote that headline. Yeah. Alan Lewis wrote that cut line in there, the new wave of British heavy metal. I don't know if you can see it there, but so Alan Lewis wrote that, editor of Sounds. So this is the first mention when they went to see this, and this is from May 19th, 79. So it's early in 79.
That's really early on, isn't it?
Yeah. So that's when it first gets. And then I've got, I did the new wave of British heavy metal trilogy of books, and I've done a Saxon and a Motorhead and 5 Maiden books and stuff as well. But and that's all timeline and quotes of the whole thing. But totally off topic. I want to go back to something you mentioned before. I hate Santana, right? And I remember talking.
I did want to end this with this because I'm gonna push back against you in a minute. So
okay.
Don't worry.
I don't want to end at all. I'm not saying I want to end. I would love to talk to you for as long as you want to talk, but because I want to also push back about your thoughts on Queen. So I remember talking to Greg Rowley once, and you're the perfect guy to ask this question. I'm sincerely asking this question because he even didn't articulate it perfectly. Santana, to me, as soon as I hear any Santana, I'm instantly depressed. The way that when you turn on the TV and you see an old dusty, soap opera on in the afternoon, like your brain all of a sudden just melts out of your sockets, right? I find Santana so depressing because I hate those creepy sort of minor scales and chords. What is it about Latin rock that would depress me that way?
I don't know. I absolutely love Santana. Now this is really interesting because you the other day you were talking about sort of early new wave of British heavy metal bands, and you got onto Gary Moore, and you mentioned Back on the Streets. Now Back on the Streets for me, those Simon Phillips drum parts and the sort of double bass drum and all, and it's jazz rock fusion. They're pulling it's because there's a jazz rock fusion thing that comes through as well at that point. And you were quite critical of Gary Moore and the sort of ensuing albums like Corridors of Power and what was the other one? There was another one anyway. I can't remember it.
Yeah, I don't like Gary Moore at all. I don't like him as a guitarist. I don't like him as a writer. I like him a little bit as a singer. I liked his power trio blues version of him near the end, but I didn't like any of that. And of course, I love Thin Lizzy, right? So.
And then the other one was the Ian Gillan band that then sort of morphs into Gillan, and people forget that Gillan in 1980, 81, 82, there were so many bands that were actually a part of the movement that people now say weren't, like Rainbow and White Snake. If I think of new wave of British heavy metal, I just think Rainbow and White Snake, even though they're not. But that was all kicked up in that period of time, So I loved Rainbow. Was the first sort of heavy metal band I liked. That was All Night Long was the song.
Yeah.
I remember.
Well, remember we were going to have this whole episode be about the new wave of British heavy metal police, right? And they police so many things about it. And the big contentious one is Motorhead, a new wave of British heavy metal band, it gets policed. But Gillan is perfect for that as well, as is the Michael Schenker group or the Ozzy Osbourne band, right?
Well, the thing is that what's fired this up was chatting to Shane Embry from Napalm Death, which is the ultimate. You can't. I mean, there's no one in the world they're going to say, well, they're not. I think some actually said, oh, I don't think they're a heavy metal band. I was like, what? Napalm Death aren't a heavy metal band. What are you on about? What?
Yeah.
And this thing is like, it's like the sort of, I don't know, it's like jihadist Taliban. You know that they're the last one standing will be the one that's the most sort of. And that's what could happen with heavy metalers, as they kill each other off because, they're not heavy enough. And anyway, I was chatting to Shane and we was chatting, he mentioned heavy metal. I said, Shane, what do you think's heavy metal? And he just turned around and went, the Scorpions. And as he said it, I went, yes. And I knew what he meant. I knew what he meant. That was the perfect choice of band because heavy metal is, it's no one. I don't think the term was really used until the early 80s, and it meant a whole bunch of things much wider than we now term it. Kids who have grown up listening to Avenged Sevenfold and Black Dahlia murders and all these things they have such a. It's all about screaming, and they don't understand. They don't understand that there's a certain. How can I put the word? How would you describe it? There's a certain Scorpions. Ingvi Malmsteen has it. Rainbow
let me
has
let me
it.
cut Andy. Let me say why Scorpions is a great answer. Okay, so number one, if you go back to everything I said about classical music,
That's
right?
what I was trying to get
Yeah,
towards.
but
Yeah,
now you're over to Germany, right? So
yeah.
I remember getting as a new release, first Scorpions album I ever heard of was Virgin Killer in 1976 as a new release, right? And you played that record and you heard the song Virgin Killer on that, which is so incredibly extremely metal for 1976, right? But the rest of it is a little bit like we're almost like from an Eastern Bloc country where we don't quite have a handle on how to make Western music yet.
Yeah.
It's a little all over the place. You got the little Ollie 1/3 of every album and all that kind of stuff, right? But that whole idea of thinking that it comes from classical, well, now if you go over to the mainland and you're in Germany, you're really thinking classical. So one thing that I remember just thinking all along is that even though these Scorpions albums are a little patchy and they aren't my favorite band of all time,
No,
there's
neither
something
mine.
extra cool about them just because they're from Germany, right? So that's a little extra cool about it. And I remember when moving forward, getting Van Halen as a new release, right? I remember finding almost 2/3 of that album not heavy enough, right? But the 1/3 that was heavy enough, I remember distinctly the thought was, this is the only American band that is as good as Scorpions at making heavy metal. So there's another.
The thing is that when that's what I liked about the Scorpions, is because when they get it right, and they don't always get it right, but when they do get it right, they really get it right, and that's sort of more interesting than having a whole album of it. You don't realize that at the time. And I always felt with Van Halen, because I put them on my list of great heavy metal bands, and everybody was going, they shouldn't be on. I was thinking, you don't understand atomic punk and tracks like that was so heavy. There's nobody in the world that had gone that heavy. Van Halen would go that heavy, then they would go somewhere else, and then they go back that heavy again. And in terms of the speed stuff, which really starts off, I think, with possibly Speed King, Deep Purple are the originators of that. Sabbath never did that so much, but the sort of frantic double time, which gets faster.
Hard Lovin' Man is the most important song historically on that album in rock, right? Because it's got the gallop. It's absolutely nothing to do with the blues. It's fast. So Hard Lovin' Man is sort of like the first Iron Maiden song.
Yeah.
Right?
And then Fireball, that track.
Yeah,
the double bass drums on that. So
Thrash,
that's the thing we're describing. It's nobody ever did this platonic statement of heavy metal. You just can't. It's a dilution of all these things. Somebody does one thing, somebody does the other, and I think what's really interesting is that by the time you get to 1980s, the way people then go, we know what these elements are. I wish someone would just stitch them all together. Now, I would say the band that stitches them all together, and I'm really going to put my neck out here, I would say it's Iron Maiden.
Mm-hmm.
I think Iron Maiden sit right in the middle of that. I think Iron Maiden you could argue with a sort of realization of this heavy metal ideal.
Well, okay, so one thing a couple things I want to bring up. So I've often quipped, and I think I did a podcast episode on this. If you want to be the ultimate non-music snob, music geek, right, and say what are your top 10 heavy metal, new wave of British heavy metal albums, right? You could literally have 8 albums in there that are by Def Leppard and Iron Maiden. You could have 5 Iron Maiden albums there. You could put 3 Def Leppard albums in there, right? So, if you're a music snob, of course, you're going to have all rarities and obscurities and stuff, and you won't put any of them in there. But to get back to your point, so what my definition of the new wave of British heavy metal, I think a good definition is drunk priest, right? And Iron Maiden is the ultimate drunk priest band. You listen to those albums, and it's basically like, we're doing what Judas Priest was already doing on Stained Class and Sin After Sin, but we're doing it on 3 beers, basically, right? So I often say drunk priest or I say punk priest, because new wave of British heavy metal bands are just like the loose bolted version with no budget version of Judas Priest on CBS Records, right? Kind of thing, right? But the other thing, I had this idea, and Pete and I did a couple of episodes on this, and one of them was this idea of the bike wheel, right? The new wave of British heavy metal bike wheel. Now, it sounds like you're putting Iron Maiden at the hub of the bike wheel, and then, like Prague, everything has a bike wheel. You go off on the spokes in various directions, right? You go to the Invention of Doom with Witchfinder General. You go to Prague with Saracen, and Pop Prague with Demon, but what I get my hackles up about is people say Def Leppard isn't new wave of British heavy metal because Joe Elliott said so, right? Or because they left America and Hello America, or because they're on Phonogram, or because of Pyromania, right? But I actually put at the very middle of the bike wheel, I have two albums that I think of all the time: Def Leppard On Through the Night, and the second Tigers of Pantang album, Spellbound. To me, those are the epitome of drunk priest, or priest on a budget. And to me, that is the center of it. Now, when you bring up Maiden was obviously the most. What I love about Maiden is they're still a new wave of British heavy metal. They never changed their sound until this very day. They're still doing exactly the same thing they did, basically starting on Peace of Mind, right? Because that's when you get the drummer with a personality that's this trademark personality who's going to be there forever. But I think the great thing about Maiden is, yeah, they absolutely they dominated that entire thing with the excitement of the songwriting and the rapid changes in the band, and moving to Martin Birch, moving to Bruce Dickinson, moving to Nico McBrain, and they had 5 albums in the new wave of British heavy metal era. Like, they were very prolific, and they're all really sort of exciting. So you're right, Maiden is the epitome that way. And if I was to take one Maiden album to put at that bike wheel with that Def Leppard and Tigers, I'd pick Killers.
Yeah, I knew you'd pick Killers, because that's the one that someone in the know would pick. Although so this is my take on it. With Iron Maiden, they are like a sort of punk drunk Judas Priest. I think that's a brilliant analogy. Paul Di'Anno, the late great Paul Di'Anno, adds something to them right at the beginning, which they never quite have again. This is why we love Killers. It's the Iron Maiden I discovered. I can remember Bruce Dickinson in Samson. I can remember him being nobody in Samson and listening to Samson. And I was really into their drummer, was it Thundersticks, who had a bit of character. And then they grabbed him and brought him across to Iron Maiden. We all loved Paul Di'Anno. The progginess that Iron Maiden then take on Number of the Beast, I feel was being done by Diamond Head before then. Now, obviously, Diamond Head had just up from the road, and I actually spoke to Brian Tatler last night to see if he would jump in. I was going to surprise you with Brian Tatler on this chat, which would have been amazing, because for me, Brian is a key guy, and when you chat to him, you really get this idea of the influences that were on him, which was totally progressive rock, absolutely, without a doubt, and you hear that with Iron Maiden, because I think it's very interesting when Bruce Dickinson comes in, he is channeling Peter Hamill, Van der Graaf Generator. It's exactly the same voice as Van der Graaf Generator, same as John Lydon was with the Sex Pistols. That's the line through. You're totally right about Def Leppard. It's just that people don't remember because they're judging it on Pyromania. They don't remember On Through the Night, or even High and Dry is heavier, and they were an integral part. And
just to go back, Andy, the influences, I love that idea that they were metal fans, but I have this sort of idea that there's a second wave of metal that are the key influences on the new wave of British heavy metal bands, because they're all putting their bands together in 74, 75, 76. And what I think they love the most, I've often said this, I think one of the biggest influences on those bands, the second biggest is Rush. And I think the first biggest is Judas Priest, but I think they love UFO and they love Thin Lizzy as well. So there's this second wave. Rainbow is a perfect example of this second wave bands. These bands that really get going, Thin Lizzy and UFO go way back, but they really get going in 75,
Yeah,
76, right?
I agree
Yeah,
100%.
so there's
Yeah.
that wave that, and I think those are the things that you hear in new wave of British heavy metal the most. You hear a lot of Priest, you hear a lot of Rush because of the progginess,
Mm.
and you hear twin leads, and so it's not so much. You hear Deep Purple as well, but I think Rainbow's almost more important. But I think you've got that first clump making all that great music in 1970. Then nothing really new happens or super, super important until Sad Wings of Destiny. And that kind of represents the anchor album of that second wave. And those kids who are going to be in the new wave for British heavy metal at 20 years old, at 16 years old, they're being inflamed by Sad Wings of Destiny, Rainbow Rising, Thin Lizzy, Jailbreak, UFO,
Well, here's
heavy
another
pet.
thing that nobody ever mentions. I can remember being sat in Amsterdam once with Phil Carson, who signed, he'd worked with Led Zeppelin, and he signed AC/DC to Atlantic Records. And he said the big problem with signing AC/DC is he said they wanted to get rid of one of the guitarists. They wanted to get rid of Malcolm Young. Because
Wow.
back then a rock band had one guitarist. It was like Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin. They've all got one guitarist. And as
Yeah.
much as Thin Lizzy did the twin leads, it's AC/DC who actually bring in the two guitar thing. And that run up Power Age, Highway to Hell, and then Back in Black, that was the monumental rock thing that was going on when I first got into rock. AC/DC was so important. And I think what you've got with the new wave of British heavy, again, even though it's been brought down, Motorhead have this sort of aggressive punk aspect to them. Venom have this like the darkest, heaviest, most satanic. Diamond Head have this sort of progressive thing. Each of these bands have a certain aspect, and it still doesn't quite come together until you get to sort of Iron Maiden, and it's not quite there again. I think it's the transmission of that to the Bay Area, to the Bay Area thrash metal bands. I think that's where it's really consolidated. Interestingly, is back in America. It's really hard. You go, where's the platonic new wave of British heavy metal? But there isn't really, because even Iron Maiden have that sort of idiosyncratic gallopy thing that
Mhm.
they do. They never really rock out with they don't have heavy riffs like Metallica have unbelievably heavy riffs.
Yeah, I often say that Metallica's Kill 'Em All, July 1983, is the invention of metal,
I
right?
agree. I agree. I
Instead of
remember it. Do you
heavy
remember it
metal,
coming
right?
out and hearing it for the first time?
Absolutely. And my thoughts were exactly this. So I remember hearing it and going, they're playing the money riff all the time.
Totally
This is a
right.
very shouty, cardboardy, strange kind of vocal. This is a very angry vocal. I don't remember my new wave of British heavy metal band sounding this angry about something, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I also remember that the production was better than most new wave of British heavy metal albums, and there was that palm muted tightness to it. And so they could play at impossible speeds. To me, one of the definitions I have of thrash is they close the hi-hat. And that's like the drum a corollary of palm muting on a guitar, right? So the hi-hat got closed by Lars, and also the guitar riffs were not wah, 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 it was it was now a machine gun
Yeah.
guitar riff. The palm muting was so much more exacting, and so that's why you have that connective tissue between the new wave of British heavy metal and thrash, or what I sometimes call metal. You have speed metal in the middle,
Yeah.
right? So you have Exciter and Anvil and Raven, from the new wave of British heavy metal, where it's like, here are bands playing super fast. Motorhead's important, Venom's
Mm,
important in this.
yeah.
So you have this little speed metal thing that doesn't last. And famously, Anvil does not progress past their two speed metal masterpieces,
Mm.
and then they go down because they don't become a thrash band or a metal band, right? But yeah, July 83, I just remember like it was yesterday. It's like, this singer is angry, and this production is good. And when I say the money riff thing, I always remember an interview I had with Phil Anselmo once, where he brought that up about Pantera. Is like, our secret is we play the money riff all the time,
They do.
you know. And so it's like you're right, it's like there are at least 7 to 9 amazing, amazing riffs here that you can't forget, that are just incredible
Well,
on
they've got
their
that palm
albums.
muted fast thing, but also all the thrash metal band, or Metallica did it, Slayer did it. They also do that doomy drop. They go back
Mm-hmm.
to Sabbath,
Yeah,
don't forget it,
yeah,
and the fact that they're jumping between the two and it is just a car crash change is
yeah.
incredible. And what do you think throughout the 80s? Because we've really done, I think we've done a pretty good history of heavy metal and looking at these sort of cultural aspects of it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like me that when you get to the 80s, all these things that haven't been brought together, they're brought together, but then it creates a new era. It's like there's, for the first time, really different defined groups. It's like in the 70s, you could have been a fan of Nazareth and Budgie and Led Zeppelin and, Deep Purple. But by the time you get to the 80s, there's people listening to Winger, and there's people listening to all that hair metal, and then there's the thrash metal bands, and then they're somewhere between punk, Black Flags, and and all
Yeah.
that. We're getting a split, aren't we? Which is sort of brought together for me in the whole grunge period. And I think the thing about Nirvana that's so key is whatever we were talking about, whatever we've been going on about today, whether it's the Ramones, whether it's the heaviness, the doominess, whether it's Gates of Delirium and the whole utility thing, Nirvana just cross it over to the mainstream, and it's like the Thriller of heavy metal.
Yeah, it's
And I
so
don't think
a
heavy
couple.
metal can respond. They can It can never. It's never been able to get over it in a way.
Yeah. Well, okay, so just to go back a little, I like your idea about how now we get genres, because I suppose what happens is, you're right, through the 70s, and I've often said this, right? It's like, if you were a it's just about creativity in the 70s. There weren't enough bands and there weren't enough
No,
subgenres. And I always say that Black Sabbath looked like the Eagles. They all looked the same, right? There was no uniform or whatever. So I think with the new wave of British heavy metal, you get your first identifiable and proud to be heavy metal thing. But within the new wave British heavy metal, because you have the spokes of the bike wheel, you get the first doom band and the first black metal band and all these
yeah,
things. So maybe the genres start with single bands in the new wave of British heavy metal, and then as soon as you get to thrash starts exactly the same day, pretty much, as hair metal. So now we got those two going at the same time. Soon you got death metal. Much later, you get black metal proper. But to go forward, Nirvana, I remember loving grunge when it first came out. I was right there, of boots on the ground. I was living in Vancouver, so not far from Seattle. And the thing that we loved about grunge was that it was dangerous, chaotic, explosive. You didn't know what was going to happen. Soundgarden will put out an EP and it'll have a blues jam on it, and then a heavy song, and then a post-punk song, and you were surprised all the time, right? Nirvana, I remember, essentially the approach to Nevermind for me was through Bleach first as a new release, right? Loved Bleach to death. It's so cool and so heavy. So this is the funny thing about heavy metal as it moves on. It's like Green Day is actually heavier than all the heavy bands I loved in the 70s, right? Because it's relentless distortion, pedal, speed, and all that stuff, but it's not considered heavy metal anymore because we have to adjust with our definitions as we go. But you're right. I mean, what happens with grunge, I think it's just sort of the fact that it went mainstream or not is almost like neither here nor there. It's like it's still, I push back when people say that that's a poppy album and it's not very heavy. I think it's a fairly heavy album.
yeah. It's not that aspect. I think there was a
Yeah.
cultural crossover. I can remember, Nirvana came out, and it's like I heard it. I thought it was quite cool. To me, it was just like
Mhm.
another rock band that came out. I liked Soundgarden more because
Yeah.
they were more doomy and Black Sabbath, but Nirvana were great. It was like that.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, I'm at college, and my friends are now listening to it, and they weren't metalers. And they're all listening to it. They go, that's weird. You're listening to that. And then they're going and getting Alice in Chains albums and Pearl Jam albums. The whole thing
Yeah.
sort of crosses over. And what I find, if we now zip up to the right to today, and the sort of trouble I caused on my channel, which I deliberately did with my critique of The Warning, because the
Right.
Warning now are the basic these nice polite girls from Mexico, and all the metal fans are like have watched them come up, and they're polite and nice, and they've learnt their Metallica songs, and they've learnt this, and aren't they doing a good job? And it's the complete whatever this story that starts off with the Sonics and MC5 and Blue Cheer, and then Sabbath and the Devil's Cord and all this stuff, this journey up to the Warning, which are basically they're all of our daughters, aren't they? They're our daughters, and we're proud of them for being able to play this heavy metal
Yeah.
because it's such a wonderful style of music, and it's become. I think that's Nirvana that started that. You know. Hang on, I'm doing
Yeah.
an interview, Daddy. I'm doing an interview. Sorry about this.
That's all right. Yeah. But like I say, on the same token, there's also this incredibly progressive, extreme metal that happens, and it's sort of mainstream. You think of someone like Lorna Shore or whatever, right? But before we go, I want to go back to Queen for a second, right? So
Yeah.
I love all your treatises on Queen, but I think you sell them a little bit short. And to me, I can't get this out of my head. It's always been this way. And I may be wrong or whatever, but to me, the only two streaks of incredible musical genius, besides, I love all your Frank Zappa stuff you do as well. I mean, that's incredible, right? You're so good on all that. But besides Frank Zappa, I think Queen 1 through Jazz and Judas Priest Sad Wings of Destiny through Hellbent for Leather are the greatest runs of massive musical genius in all. There's no prog run like that, I don't think. To me Queen and Priest are that. Now the thing about Queen, I've always had this sort of idea, and it's a little bit like Aerosmith rocks is everything a young kid would want out of the Rolling Stones. It's like just way better.
Oh yes, than without a doubt. Yes, right? That's brilliant.
But
yeah.
I think Queen 1 was everything you would have wanted out of Led Zeppelin.
Yeah.
To me, so I know what you're getting at when you say, oh, they're just stringing a bunch of ideas together, right?
No, I'm not saying that. If I listen to, say, if I put on Killer Queen, my jaw hits the floor. They're astonishing.
Yeah,
and it's like this. It's so musically advanced, and it's so unintellectual at the same time. The lyrics never have any depth to them. It's all gloss. It's got an aspect of glam that David Bowie. It's high art, high end. It's low art. It's Queen are just in their own bracket, and it's so incredibly done. Yeah. And I think their greatest album is Jazz, because that artifice is when it's just at such an incredible level, and I really love the game as well. That
greatest drum sound of all time is Jazz, right? I mean, that drum sound, that to me, my favorite drum sounds ever are Abacab and Jazz. Yeah. I just love
so I think Queen are astonishing, and they are able to write songs that cross over into the mainstream, that have that mainstream utility to them, and so that's why.
I don't care about that part, though. That part I almost put them down for. Like, I'm upset at Queen starting at the Game in Hot Space, right? I'm talking about that run where, my sort of short form version of that is always, I think I say Queen or Led Zeppelin on steroids, Aerosmith or Rolling Stones on steroids, right? So it's almost like the we've gone to the gym and pumped up version.
Oh yeah, they've got that. But what I'm saying is, as well as that, We Are the Champions is the most pop song of all songs. It's like that's the song they're going to sing on the football terraces. That's the one that they're going to sing when you're going on holiday. You could go, you could walk into anywhere, any type of person, young or old, and start singing We Are the Champions, and everyone will join in. Queen have that aspect of them. At their peak, they have that. They really are an incredible band. They almost occupy their own world. So don't ever think I put them down. What it is that they're not Led Zeppelin, they're not Black Sabbath, they're not Nirvana. That they can cross over to mainstream, but when you go back to say 77, 78, they're one of the heaviest bands on the planet. This thing we're saying you're searching for heaviness. They do so many heavy things that no band was doing at the time.
See, that's the other thing about the genius part, right? I say this about Queen all the time. They strike me as a little bit like like Van Halen, I suppose, but Queen were a band that it's almost like Paul McCartney and Helter Skelter. So Queen is basically saying, we don't like heavy metal. Heavy metal is gauche. It's below us, right? But if you want to hear what Queen would sound like if we made heavy metal, here are the 5 best heavy metal songs ever
you've ever
written.
heard, yeah.
Boom, mic drop, right? Modern Times rock and roll.
And I can
Sheer
remember
Heart
thinking this in the
Attack.
1980s where I think, oh, they've gone rubbish now, Queen, they're not even worth listening. And then they bring One Vision out. And like, it was way better than Bon Jovi or any of the 80s rock bands. You
No,
know?
but I'm talking about those 70s ones
Yeah.
that were technical and progressive, and you could compare them to the very best things Judas Priest were doing, like Modern Times rock and roll, like Stone Cold Crazy, right? White Man somewhat, but definitely, and for sheer punky production values and the abstract Platonic ideal of heaviness, the song Sheer Heart Attack, right? And the way at the end where it stops and you get that great ploipy tablet kind of fill thing, and then they kick back in, right? Nothing heavier in the entire planet, right?
But they're not Judas Priest, they're not Led Zeppelin, they're not Black Sabbath, they're not Deep Purple. We all know they're not. It was really interesting. I can remember going to see Black Sabbath when they had got back together in 2000 with Planty, and I was singing War Pigs, and Robert turned around to me and goes, "Do you know the lyrics to this?" And I went, "Yeah." I said, "Don't you know?" And he went, "No." We go, "What song's this?" And I said to Robert, "It's War Pigs." He went, "Oh yeah." And I said, "You do know we all bracket Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and Sabbath. Everybody in the world brackets those together." He went, "Do they?" I went, "Yeah." I think I was the only person of actually. I don't think anyone in Led Zeppelin's realised that at all. Yeah. And then he lumped Sabbath and Deep Purple together. But he hadn't put him together. And so it's really interesting to see how all this plays out and how people see this. And the reason is, I think, it's because one of the things we're skirting around is to like heavy metal is to wear the badge of heavy metal, isn't it? And that's why we have to define it all the time, because it's like being in a club. And I'll never leave the heavy metal club. It's always the special music. I still get it now. You know, if I go and put on like Rainbow Rising, I feel like it's not the same as going and putting, say, an ELO album on, or Michael Jackson, which I also love, but it's not the same, because I can go back into that club and I know that if I meet somebody and they're in that club, we can have the same conversation. I think that's does that
and
make
I think
sense?
you like that because getting back to that thing about crowding around the hood and looking at an engine, I think there's something about heavy metal that is just objectively impressive. I mean, it's like this idea that Billy Joel sits around and tinkles on his piano, and you wonder, what is the point of Billy Joel? Why did he get into this music? It's like old people's music, right? How did he wind up there, right? But with heavy metal, you go, it's kind of sensible that people would want to come up with these guitar riffs and play fast and play powerful drums and stuff. That word powerful, right? Powerful doesn't have to mean brute power. It could just mean impressive, right?
Well, Billy Joel was in that band, wasn't he, beforehand?
Right. I think it was Attila or whatever.
Yeah, Attila. I mean, Attila's the most metal name. The album's quite heavy. It's not. It doesn't. That would be one of those albums. If you saw that and you saw them on the front, I think it's about 1970, isn't it? It's called Attila. They're surrounded by raw meat. I mean, they're ahead of them. In some respects, they're ahead of the game, aren't they, Billy Joel?
but the point is like, okay, so this is like the most impressive kind of drumming I can do, the most impressive guitar I can do, the most impressive guitar sound. You think of a Rob Halford. This is like the most impressive, objectively speaking, not subjectively speaking, kind of singing you can do. It's not Billy Joel singing, right? It's Rob Halford singing, right? So all of that also equates to prog. Why people like prog? Objectively, those prog guys are saying, well, let's clearly try to make the best music possible. And so it's not dealing with the subjective thing of what is the perfect shiny pop jewel of a song, right?
Yeah. And it's ridiculous, because an ABBA song is just as virtuoso as a Yes or Genesis song. The musicianship, the composition, everything, the ability to pull that off, it's like is just as hard. But the thing is that the pretense of cleverness is worn on its sleeve by prog and metal. Now,
Yeah.
I have a really contentious view on this, and I think it goes back to a really strong, evolved thing that males have, is in that for hundreds of thousands of years, when we worked as a group to go out and we would have to the men would go out, they'd have to fight battles against other tribes, or they'd have to go out and catch certain beasts, so if they're going off to catch the woolly mammoth, then there's these youngish men, they're in their 20s, and they are like the alpha males. They're able to direct the group. They go out and they are brilliant at what they do, whether it's the bow and arrow or the spear between the eyes of the mammoth, and I think young boys would have been in that group and have known, if I'm going to survive, if I'm going to be the same, I have to look up to them. And it becomes a spear chucking competition. And I think that adolescent aspect, which is linked into sort of quite a homoerotic thing, that where some boys are a little bit, confused sexually. They could go towards the incel route of Rush, or they could go to the sort of homoerotic of sticking I don't know, Winger up or Manowar up on their wall. And so there's a lot of that adolescent secret world which is bound up in heavy metal. And I think that's what you're talking about having your head around the flashy car. It's like the guy that drives into town with that car, and he steps out and he's got that car, and everyone else walks up who hasn't got the car and goes, oh my God, look at that car. It's that whole thing.
And you just want to be the best drummer, and you want your buddies to think you're an amazing drummer, right?
Yeah. I think that aspect of a certain psychology that young boys have at a certain age, and then if you've gone through that and the confusion of that, I think these bands really did a good job of soaking that up in a way, which meant forever we have a certain nostalgia for these bands because of what they have. And then you said you get to a certain age, and then you suddenly go, oh, the Ramones are actually good, and you don't have to be playing like really heavy riffs and having really fast bits and showing that you can drum, and really fast double bass drums. And the thing that I find so difficult with modern metal is, of course, with the advancement of Pro Tools and the computers and all of that, then that has become so apparent that it's just program music pretending to be played by people who can't play. They have become like Marvel comic characters now, the metal bands. They can't play that stuff. Nobody can. But all the little boys are very impressed by it. Yeah. And it's not all the stuff that we used to lament when we used to say, I wish they would be more heavy, and I wish they hadn't done that ballad, and I wish they weren't like that, and I wish Iron Maiden didn't do all that gallopy stuff, and and all that type of stuff actually was what made it so great. When you go back and listen to it, it's the idiosyncrasies that make Gillan and Van Halen.
Well, I often say about Rush, it's like, okay, the critics put them down because there was just this relentless onslaught of them trying to be clever on their instruments or lyrically, right? But the funny thing is, they dared to do that. Whereas they know they're going to be in for some stick for doing this. And they're not going to be critics' darlings. But when you stand back and look, I mean, the other clever thing that Rush did that gave them such notoriety is they literally, duct taped hard rock to prog. I mean, and nobody else had ever done that before, and they were essentially the band doing that, right?
Well, the thing with Rush is that's interesting is that I remember talking to an English professor once, and I said, "What do you think of Tolkien, Lord of the Rings?" And he goes, "It's okay. It's a little bit adolescent, isn't it? It's not like Dostoevsky." And there was this idea that Lord of the Rings was adolescent, and I was like, "Well, I think it's bloody brilliant. I love Tolkien," and I was all a bit like that. And Rush are the heavy rock version of that. And so the certain type of people that can stomach a little bit of Aerosmith being sort of womanizing and being, and all that type of bravado that we can associate. Rush don't do that, because Rush are making aggressive heavy metal, but for very intelligent teenage boys who are searching for some sort of meaning, and they provide it. They provide that meaning in a whole bunch of different ways.
Yeah.
And so the amount of jazz musicians I've met that started off by listening to Rush, the amount of like advanced dance music producers that listen to Rush, Rush are an incredible band because of the breadth of what they do. And this is my whole point. This is what I tried champion. You know, yes, when you're like, I'm nearly 60 years old, you know, when it's like I'm 57 years old this year, you know, I'm sure if I heard Rush now, I would think they were childish, but that is not to demote the role that they play for certain kids. Now, I can remember when I was teaching music, I was in a college once, and all these kids were into metal, and they were into like stoner rock and all this type of stuff that they were listening to. And I was chatting, and I mentioned Rush, and I was talking and referring to them, and the kid said, Andy, we don't know what Rush is. And I went, what? I said, we don't know what Rush is. We know there's a band called Rush. You mentioned it. We'd never heard them. And I said, right. And I was in this class with the great big sound system. So I stuck Cygnus X1 on. And these kids, these young boys, again, when they heard it, their jaws hit the floor.
Mm-hmm.
And to them, it was the most psychedelic, out there, druggy, wild, limits of your imagination music. And it is. Yeah. It is. Yeah. Cygnus X1 is. And that bit when it was going, bow, bow, ba-da-dum. Yeah. And these kids were sat there going, oh my God, you know, because Rush had outdone anything that they were listening to at that time. Yeah. They thought they were cool.
Well, okay. So number one, you know, when Rush was operating in 75, 76, 77, one of the big deals is they are breaking a record. They are doing this, this new thing that people hadn't done before, cross-stitching prog. And, you know, literally Rush got famous because Alex turned on a distortion pedal. You know, other than that, it's just Genesis and Yes music in a way, right? But I want to get also to this point, you know, Neil Peart, is he the most overrated drummer of all time?
Oh, right? Without a doubt.
So number one, I agree, because number one, if you are rated the greatest drummer of all time, chances are you might be overrated, right? Because there's a lot of people in the world, right? But when you defend Neil, and say, well, he deserves to be there as the greatest drummer of all time, it's because there's this idea that I think is valid, that Neil Peart is the Beatles of drumming, right? So Neil is the one guy where, you know, most casual fans, or if you're a drummer or whatever, can think of many fills and many 5-second to 10-second snatches of Neil Peart drumming, more so than any other drummer. So when you say Beatles is the greatest band of all time, or even when you say Ringo Starr is a great drummer, right? When you say either of those two things, Neil kind of deserves that same sort of thing, because he's super inspirational on people, like you just mentioned, right? He's really, really inspirational. He's made all sorts of interesting little drum hooks and done interesting little things, even the way he's recorded, even how many toms he has, right? How many tinkly different kinds of cymbals he has, right? All of these things add up to him being a very hooky drummer. It's hard being a hooky drummer. He is one. The other big hooky drummer that people would put in this conversation and say he's the Beatles of drummers is John Bonham. People remember many John Bonham drum parts, right? So you can't say that about all these people who can run rings around Neil technically, right? So he's there because he's the Beatles of drummers.
But the point with Neil Peart is, I'll tell you where the problem is, and I'll start with a story. When I was playing in IQ, we were playing in Montreal, and we looked up, and Rush were playing in Montreal in this huge, big Enorma Dome, and we were playing the big prog festival there. And so because Terry Brown had produced I Sitting Comfortably and there was a link, somehow our lighting engineer had a contact with Howard Underliger, there, Rush's lighting engineer. Anyway, but fact is the crew invited us over. So we go there and I'm backstage at a Rush gig and I can't believe we're meeting all the crew. I cannot believe it. And then one of them goes, which one of you is the drummer? And I went, I'm the drummer. And they went, go through that door. And I went, what? And so I opened this door, and it was like just dark stairs up to an open like hatch. So I walked up these stairs on my own, and as I pushed myself through the hatch, this stairway went straight up into the center of Neil Peart's drum kit. I sort of walked out, looked at the completely empty venue, 30,000 seaters. I sit down on his kit, and I'm behind Neil Peart's kit. I can see Alex Lifeson's amps there. Well, they're not amps. He's got all his Barbie dolls lined up. You've got all the chicken things going, spinning around, Geddy Lee's keyboard, and I'm sat on the and I think it's probably the most hair-raising, shocking, even more than when my kids were born, doing that. It's like it was, because that's how much this is how much Neil Peart means to me. So I've tried to embody it in that story. Now, I'm a drummer. I have got more technique than Neil Peart. That's the bottom line. I have got way more technique than chops than him. I know it, and I'm not the most chopsy drummer in the world compared to, say, Marco Miniman, and I play with those guys. Neil Peart technically is not the huge technical. He's a very good drummer and he's got good chops. There's a huge, vast amount of drummers that have great chops in music. Phil Collins has got great chops. Bill Bruford has got great chops. The greatest drummers are session drummers. This is the whole point, that people don't understand what a session drummer does. They don't understand that Neil Peart couldn't do that. That Neil Peart was great because he's like Larry Mullen or Stuart Copeland. They're brilliant because of the band they're in. They find the right band for what they do, and then they could do what they love, and it creates signature drumming. And that's what you're talking about, is signature drumming.
And Andy, you say the greatest drummers are session drummers. The greatest drummers now are probably 22 years old, have never made an album, or they're in a metal band, right?
If you just
so it's changed, technique, right?
Yeah. But the thing is, even when you mention technique, there's people who can play very fast. But could these guys walk into onto a set with an orchestra and look at 20 minutes of sight reading and play those parts down without going wrong first at sight? I mean, for me, that's the peak of drumming. That is the peak of drumming. Is somebody like a Vinnie Colaiuta can turn up to any session. I mean, the famous one is Steve Gadd, that he turned up at a session so blitzed out of his mind on drugs. And he goes into the studio and he starts to play and it's all going wrong. And he's going, this isn't working. He's reading the chart and it's not working. He's reading it, it's not working. And they go, let's go in and see what's going wrong. So the producer goes in. He's got the music upside down. So they turn the music the right way around, hit record, and Gadd, blitzed out of his head, plays through that to a point that when he gets to the end, because it's difficult stuff, he nails it, finishes, first take done, he's packing his drum, and they're all applauding him because he's a monster, an absolute utter monster that can play anything. And Neil Peart, if you got Steve Gadd in Rush, he'd have done a better job.
Right, yeah.
That's the bottom line, he would have done a better job. It would have been different and you might not like it, but Neil Peart would have done a better job because he would have done it and grooved.
Yeah. But then again, like we say,
and I'm saying, I love it. Because music's not about the best or the worst. We trade off it, on these. Yeah. It's brilliant to talk about it. It's brilliant to talk about music like the way we do. I think it's as nearly as exciting as listening to it. This is why people like watching these things. It's great to talk about it because it's great to check what you like against somebody else and see where you agree and disagree and don't agree. It's a really interesting thing to do. But in reality, there's no best or worst. I mean, if you're measuring it on who's like the most famous drummer in the world that did really interesting signature drum parts, and Neil Peart's the best drummer in the world, him and John Bonham. And Ringo, they're the three.
Well, the fact of the matter is, if we were having this conversation in 1972, we'd have maybe 100 drummers total to compare, and we'd actually arrive somewhere at the right answer. But now we're doing it with probably 550,000 drummers.
And you know what the other aspect? The other aspect of this is my friend Kevin Gammon, who actually called up just as we were chatting. He was the guy I was ignoring, and he was in the band of Joy with Robert Plant and John Bonham. He played with Jimmy Cliff alongside the Stones. He used to jam with Jimi Hendrix in the 60s. That guy rang up, his right goes back to that. And when he learned the guitar in the 1950s, being a Scotty Moore fan, he said he would have to wait for the track to be on the radio. He would grab his guitar and try and nail 2 bars learning it. He said, Chuck Berry would come on and go, oh my, Chuck's on. And he'd get this guitar, try and learn that riff. And then you have the first 2 bars down. And then you'd have to wait. And then 3 days later, oh, Chuck's on again. And he said, that's how they learned. And now everything is laid out before. And people don't understand that the Hendrixes and Jeff Becks, they don't understand where they came from. It's that how limited what they heard was, where their influences came. I mean, when Hendrix arrives in London in 1966, it's the fact that he's bringing, the real blues from America over, the Chitlin circuit and the show that goes with that, because that you couldn't be influenced by that unless it walked into your town.
Yeah.
And so this is over and over again in the history of music. When you study, you see that these events are happening. In the old days, it's literally somebody goes from this town to the other town, and that creates something, because you couldn't just go on the internet and find, and so this is why when you go and listen to a drummer like Ringo Starr is the best musician in the Beatles. That's what I think. They went to the studio. They were a very good type band, but their drummer wasn't cutting it. So they went back to Liverpool and picked the best guy in Liverpool, and it was Ringo. And when Ringo walked in, Ringo nailed it, and George Michael went, "Yeah, that's it," and he nailed it for the rest of time. Now, he couldn't play like Thomas Lang or Marco Miniman or any of these guys. Ringo couldn't. But in 1962, 63, he was the best guy around, because he could walk into Abbey Road and nail hooky drums without, that sounded just great.
Yeah.
For the rest of time, it's like, and I always say this with Ringo. You watch the Get Back thing. He sat there. He's got his little table. He's ready to go the whole time, because they're faffing around. He's ready to go, and as soon as they go, he goes down, and that take is done. They can get all these kids that can play Avenged Sevenfold and all this stuff. You can get them all online. If you stuck with George Martin in 1963 in the studio, go, right, put it down, they would have been there. They would have got the sack. People there's all these different ideas of what makes a good player and what doesn't make a good player. Ringo in 63, with what was required at that point, was the best guy going.
Yeah. Yeah.
All the other bands had session drummers on them. Why is that?
Yeah. 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 And I think it does come down to also like what you did at a certain time, in terms of like the comparison being you're breaking a sports record, you're doing something new for that time, and then someone else does something better, and there is no better or best kind of thing. It's because, like I say, is the Beatles the best band in the world, or is Dream Theater the best band in the world, right? So, objectively speaking, Dream Theater is running circles around the Beatles, right? But, there is that platonic ideal of songwriting and stuff. And Neil Peart, you could say he's, remember Rick Beato did an episode on the greatest drum parts, right? And he had a Neil way up high. And I think he might even had two Neil Peart.
Yeah, you're going to have two or three. I mean,
that's kind of interesting. So if Rick Beato did a list of the 200 most memorable drum parts, right? Neil might have more parts on there than any other drummer, right? And then all of a sudden, is that how you measure best?
Here's something that I had to learn in the industry, which really, was a real disturbing, almost like did me in, is on a session where I was playing and the producer's sort of going, you're doing too much. And I go, well, I'm not doing any fills. I'm playing a straight rock beat. Yeah, but it's the way you're hitting the snare drum. What do you mean? They go, you're hitting the snare drum, you're like grooving. Well, you don't want it to groove. No, we don't want it to groove. We don't want it to stand out. We don't want your bass drum to stand out. We don't want your snare drum to stand out. When you listen to this record, we want the drums to not be a feature. We don't want any character in it. We just want the song to come through. And these guys who work out in Nashville, they could do it all day long. Right? And it's like this story I often tell when I was working up at it was basically, we had one of the engineers of Peter Gabriel, and he was talking about when Manu Katché left the band, and because it's Peter Gabriel, said, well, who should we get in on drums? I said, well, let's get Billy Cobham, best drummer in the world. Let's get Billy in. Billy Cobham's the best drummer in the world. They bring Billy in, and he plays, and he sounded like Billy Cobham playing in Peter Gabriel's band. It wasn't right, because he was too much of a great drummer. That most drumming is you have to disappear so the song comes out.
Interesting.
And so there's all these different aspects of drumming. There's all these different aspects of playing. There is people, I think that the fastest guitarists in the world are going to be metal guitarists when they're not. Most session guitarists can play really fast because they can play anything, but they don't because they never get asked to do it. And every now and then you'll go, because I can remember that as well. Is that hearing session guitarists? It's like the whole jazz fusion thing. The fast guitaring, all that comes from Al Di Meola, John McLaughlin. It's all the jazz guitar guys who had to show the metalers how to play guitar, and they brought that across. And so I think it's a silly thing to really take seriously, but you are right. It is what makes heavy metal. That metaphor of standing around the car looking at the engine is so true. Yeah, it's a wonderful thing. Do you think it's over? I think it's over now, pretty much.
Well, that's all tied up in the whole where is the industry, right? I mean,
Yeah.
is it streaming? Is it playing live? Is it being on TikTok? You know, what is fame? What is sales? How do you make your money at it, right? So over, I mean, I don't know. Music is still very, very exciting, and there's always new crazy things
Mm.
being done. And heavy metal gets more extreme in every direction all the time, whether it's drone or sludgy or it's the super
Mm.
technical rhythmic stuff we've talked about. I mean, look at Meshuggah just built, you know, caused a beast to happen, right? With the whole degent thing
Oh yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
like, I mean, drumming can be fairly incredible these days, right? But I love watching all your stuff though about how it ain't drumming on the record though, right? It's all programming or whatever, right?
Well,
I mean,
that
that's
was a few years
fascinating.
back. I'll tell you that was
Yeah.
a few years back. Now, what's happened is kids have been hearing, because I can remember being on a forum probably 15 years ago, and somebody
Mhm.
said, I'm trying to learn this extreme metal track, and I can't get the double bass drums. It's at 300 BPM, blah, blah, blah. How do you do it? And then this guy came in and said, well, as the world record is 280 BPM, I would say it's impossible because the bass drums were programmed. But the fact is, kids have been listening to those now, and kids can do it. That guy, Matt Garsker from Animals as Leaders, is just the. I mean, you want to see. I mean, you want to see the greatest drummer in the world. It's him. It's not Neil Peart.
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
Matt Garsker's
Exactly.
a
The
shot.
records are broken all the
He's
time, right?
just
That's the point.
insane. I
Yeah.
don't know what to say. I got a
Yeah.
ton of chops. 20 years ago, I could play. Now these kids that are coming, he's not a kid, but these guys that are playing in these bands, their ability is astonishing, and that guy could play anything,
Yeah.
absolutely anything. But the thing is, when I listen to the Animals as Leaders record, I go, I wish they'd produce it so I can actually hear the drums. He's
Yeah.
played brilliant, but they have just polished it up so much that I can't hear the drums. And then I go back and listen to, say, Presence by Led Zeppelin and Bonham. You just feel it. It's that, and I just think that's the guts of metal. That's what I love about it when it feels like it's flying and it's heavy. And I go
Mhm.
back to Sabbath always, and Bill Ward's the man.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
no thunder. It's almost like sometimes he's playing like the guy from the Doors. Sometimes it's so subtle what he's doing.
Yeah.
Um, and then the heaviness comes from something else with Bill Ward. It's just incredible. But the whole band, none of them do what metal does.
Yeah.
Ozzy's the most unheavy metal singer.
That's so true. Yeah, yeah. The reason I ended this book in 1971 though is because I wanted to end it with the intentionality of Black Sabbath making Master of Reality. I mean, that album is so incredibly, incredibly heavy, notwithstanding the part that us as mathematical measures of heaviness did not like Orchid, Embryo, or Solitude on it, right?
Yeah.
But other than that, it was so incredibly heavy, and like I maintain, there really was no advancement in heaviness. There was nothing heavier than Master of Reality all the way up to Kill 'Em All.
It was like that when I was a kid. Even listening to new wave of British heavy metal, then we would go and we would listen to that riff in Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. The one that goes dun 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 dun. Nothing was as heavy as that. The Sweet Leaf riff off, and that cough comes
Yeah,
in,
yeah,
and that run from the debut album up to Sabotage is just. It's
yeah.
just sublime. It's as great as the Beatles. I don't care, and this is what I try and get across on my channel. I think that run of Sabbath albums is pure genius. It's
Well,
greater
this
than
is
the
where
Ramones, greater
Robert
than
Plant.
Velvet Underground,
I
all of
know,
that.
but this is where Robert Plant and Ian Gillan and Roger Glover deserve some, and Lemmy, for example. Lemmy, oh, we aren't a heavy metal band, we're rock and roll. This is where these guys deserve a little bit of criticism. They don't realize that Sabotage is an absolute masterpiece of music, of creativity.
Yeah,
And just because they're using these heavy instruments all the time and in these heavy effects, is one of the reasons they're dismissed. But I used to get upset as a kid when I would read an interview with Robert or somebody or Jimmy who'd say, "Oh, we do everything on our records." It's like, well, you know what? The record's 40 minutes long, so that means you're doing less of everything on all these records. The only difference is Black Sabbath decided we're going to do a lot of this one thing. That's the difference between these albums. So just by being I know, but just by being diverse, just being diverse is not a virtue in itself. Led Zeppelin, we're so diverse.
Don't you feel like Zeppelin, they're sophisticated and they've got taste? Sabbath haven't got that. Sabbath have got something else that's beyond that. You almost feel like they're fluking it. I mean, many of the times I talk about Sabbath, these videos turn into comedy as I start to invent the scenarios that made these tracks happen, because when I imagine them writing these songs, it sounds so ridiculous. It's like Fairies Wear Boots. It's like, why did they call it Fairies Wear Boots? Because at that time people used to go, "You're a big fairy, you are, bloody fairy." You've seen them blokes, and it's basically them going, "Have you seen those blokes that wear the boots? What, the big fairies that wear boots? Yeah, let's write a song about it." And they do, and it's unbelievable. And you think and also I feel that Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die, they're amazing. I'm going back to them now. It's like Sabbath get to this point, and then they go beyond Sabbath. And then you suddenly go, whoa, so this is where you've got this going on as well. And I know the fans don't like it at the time, but they're exploring jazz and fusion and prog and weirdness. And then when Dio comes in, Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules, my God, they're two new wave of British heavy metal. I mean, Die Young is just bloody hell. That's like 1978. They're ahead of the game again. There's a certain metallicness to that album.
Yes, but there's also a certain self-awareness and a loss of the creativity that you had on Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die, right? I mean, you listen to Heaven and Hell, and it's very strictly we're going by.
Without once Ozzy's gone, there's a naivety, there's a creative genius as though it's unleashed. So hang on. Yeah, I'm doing an interview. I'll be finished in a minute. I'm gonna have to go in a minute, Martin.
Yes, yeah. I want you to have me back one day. So let's.
Oh, you'll call you if you want to be a regular. You just let me know if you want something. If I say something, and you want to come on, you just message me and you're on. Because you're the Don, I was watching you see a Tranquility and you're the Don, so I'm so pleased for you to have come on the channel, and I know a lot of my lot are going to love the fact that we've got together and had a chat, so I think we've got to do it over and over again.
Well, wicked, man. Yeah, I'll let you go. Absolutely. I could babble on forever, so.
Yeah, and of course, this will all just go up raw. I don't do any editing, so even my.
I don't know what you're going to call this one. What do you even come up with?
I'll go now. I'm gonna go and pick the kids up from school. I'll have a think about what to call it. I mean, we've done a really good history of heavy metal, but we've also done a critique, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. But the way I see it with YouTube is that you on a YouTube video, you've got to deliver more than the title says. That's it. I think people will stay because they go, they're on about something else. I didn't expect this, like an optional extra.
Yeah.
You lot, where are you? Hello, you still here? Hardcore. Did you enjoy that? It was good, wasn't it? Give Martin a round of applause. Thank you, Martin, for coming on. Loved having you on. And, like, subscribe, do all those sort of things. And if you want Martin to come on again, then, of course, put it in the comments. But also, down below will be a link for the best place. If you don't know who Martin is, which will not be the case, you will all know who Martin is. But if you don't, where should they go, Martin, to check you out?
Oh, I guess martinpopoff.com mainly. I've got the audio podcast, History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff. We've got the YouTube channel, The Contrarians. But all the books.
I'll put all 3 of those up. Go and check him out. Check his books out. This is the man. I haven't read how heavy metal got invented. What's that book? Show us that book again. I want the copy of that. I'm obsessed with how heavy metal was invented. I've really got to read that.
I know you did a great video on it. Yeah. So.
You never can nail it anyway. I'm going to press stop now. Okay. So, and that'll be the end of the video. No editing, raw. See you all. Do you want to give them a wave? Bye-bye, Martin.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, folks.
Bye-bye.